A serial killer can't go on killing after he's dead, right? I mean, anyone experiencing anything like that, it would have to be that person's mind playing tricks on him, wouldn't it? Even if some invisible force somehow nearly drowned that person, right?
Welcome to Velarcana. Here, we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, and my husband tells the stories.
And this one begins with the wrong house. It might have been the wrong house, but it truly was impressive. It had somewhat of a medieval architecture to it. It sat on 18 acres, and it was over 10,000 square feet. It had 9 bathrooms, its own library, a completely self-contained apartment above the garage, and a huge swimming pool in the basement. But it was in major disrepair. Robert and Vicki Graves came from the city, and they weren't exactly horse people, but they always wanted to be horse people. And shortly after they pulled up to the house in 2006, well, Vicki noticed the horse stables on the property. And that got her thinking, how awesome would it be to just decide to go horseback riding, and then what? An hour later, you can be out on your horse? The only problem was the price. It was a bit more than they wanted to pay. Well, that and the dilapidated state of the property. It looked like it had been a nice place once, but for some reason, it must have sat empty for several years.
It was a very desirable location. It was a desirable property, but no one was living there. You just start to ask yourself, what's going on? What's going on?
It had sat empty so long, in fact, that now it was in such bad shape that several wild game had actually nested inside of the home, and the overgrowth outside it had taken over so badly that it would probably take a month to cut it back far enough to enjoy the property. Still, Mr. Graves put in an offer, but it was turned down, and the house sat empty for another 3 years, until finally an agreement was reached and Mr. and Mrs. Graves got their dream house. Or did they? The family, Robert and Vicki Graves, and their 2 teenage boys, Michael and William, moved into 1111 East 156th Street, Carmel, Indiana in May of 2009, and they got to work right away. It really didn't take as long as they thought to remove those pesky little critters and get the inside of the house fixed up. But the overgrowth outside? Well, it took more than the month that they thought. It actually took 2. But eventually, they got everything just right, and well, they became horse people. And everything was okay for a while, but then weird stuff started happening, like the time when Vicki was down in the pool room cleaning. The boys had tracked in quite a bit of dirt and gravel from the outside, so she was using a vacuum cleaner to clean it up. Well, just a couple of minutes into the job, the vacuum cleaner suddenly quit working. Well, she turned around and she saw that it had come unplugged from the extension cord. Obviously, she must have worked all the way to the end of the cord's length and then inadvertently pulled it out without noticing, so she went over to plug it back in. But when she did, she noticed that there seemed to be quite a bit of slack in the cord. Well, not really knowing what to think about it, she just plugged it back in and continued vacuuming. But almost immediately, it died again. Well, at this point, she was becoming frustrated. Well, she made her way back over and she plugged it back in. But this time, she took a moment to think about it. There really was quite a bit of slack in the cord. How in the world had she pulled it out of the socket? She hadn't felt any tension on the line. It was right around that time that she started feeling as if she were being watched. But this was a wide open room, and there was nobody else here. Right about now is probably a good time to tell you what Vicki did for a living and who she was. She was a medical laboratory scientist. That's a person who runs detailed tests on biological samples like DNA and then reports the results of those tests back to the physician. It's estimated that up to 70% of all decisions regarding a patient's diagnosis and treatment are based on those tests. It takes a very sober and scientific mind to do the type of work that Vicki did. And she considered herself to be, and still does, a woman who wholeheartedly believes in science. And this experience with the cord and the feeling like she were being watched in this big empty room, well, it really didn't make any sense to her. But without any further information, she just kind of brushed it off and then went back to work vacuuming. Now, this is where things get pretty interesting, because at this point, while she was vacuuming, she was watching the connection and being extra careful not to pull the cord from the socket. And as she was watching it, with plenty of slack in the cord, it just jerked itself out of the socket. Vicki later said that it looked as if some invisible force had deliberately pulled it out. Well, about that time, that feeling like she were being watched, it intensified.
There was definitely an unsettling presence there, and I got the strong sense that this invisible someone didn't want me to be in there with them.
This would be the first encounter, but it wouldn't be the last. In the last segment, I shared with you that Vicki was a scientist, while her husband Robert, the differences in couples, right? He was a car salesman, and he was pretty good at his job, made a great living. The couple together bought this house. The house was valued at well over $2 million. Anyway, in December of 2009, a man named Joe LeBlanc started working for the same car dealership that Robert did, and the two became friends. And at one point, Robert discovered that Joe lived about an hour away, and he was currently looking for a place much closer to work. And do you remember that apartment I told you about above the Graves' garage? Well, it seemed like a perfect fit. Joe needed a place to stay, and the Graves had a guest house. So in 2010, Joe and his dog Fred moved in. Joe worked all day long getting all of his things up into the apartment, and by the end of the day, he was exhausted. And almost the very moment that his head hit the pillow, he was asleep. And that's when he had one of the most vivid, and he'd find out later, prophetic dreams of his life. In the dream, he was desperately running through the woods, and he was only one step ahead of his pursuer. He wasn't sure exactly who was chasing him, if it was a man, a beast, or something else. The only thing that he knew for sure is that its intention was to get a hold of him and then to snuff the life right out of him.
I had the sensation to run. I felt like something was chasing me. I was running from something bad. I was running for my life.
A moment later, Joe woke up, but he was only half awake and still kind of mentally trapped in his dream.
I got up to run and I smashed on the door frame. I fell to my face and I just laid there in so much pain. I don't know what I was running from, but I had the sensation of getting out of there right away.
The vacuum cleaner incident with Vicki and this dream that Joe had had could probably be racked up to just some interesting moments in life. And if one looked closely, even the vacuum cleaner incident probably had a logical explanation. But what happened next went well beyond logic and is difficult to explain away in rational terms. Vicki had just come home from work, and she found Robert outside working on part of the house. Well, they visited for a few moments, and then some movement out in the woods caught the corner of her eye.
I saw someone standing there. I remember he had a red t-shirt on, and I thought, well, it could be a trespasser. He had his back to me. He was slowly walking away.
As Vicki was just about to shout, "Hey you, what are you doing on our property?" she noticed his legs, or should I say, the absence of them. From where she was standing, it looked as if this guy didn't have any legs. Surely, her eyes must have been playing tricks on her, right? So she looked closer. And sure enough, this man only existed from the thighs up. The lower half of his legs were completely missing. Well, that of course was unsettling, and from that moment on, she just couldn't take her eyes off the guy. And that's when things got even stranger.
Suddenly, he just disappeared into the tree. My heart just started beating really hard because I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this person just disappeared right in front of my eyes.
Robert had been doing his repairs up on a ladder, and when Vicki saw this guy, she stopped talking and just started staring out into the woods. Well, a second later, she gasped, And when she did, Robert, of course, shifted his attention and he started looking into the woods to the area where Vicki was staring. But by that time, the guy had already vanished. So Robert naturally asked Vicki what was wrong, and she told him what she saw. Well, there had to be some logical explanation. So Robert got off of the ladder and he made his way out into the woods, thinking that there must have been a trespasser or something, and Vicki's eyes had just been playing tricks on her.
We went over to the spot where he disappeared, and I was looking over Rob's shoulder, and there's nothing there. Absolutely nothing. This was all very unfamiliar territory. I am the biggest skeptic. I'm a scientist. You have to prove things to me, but I guarantee you, I saw what I saw.
Not long after this, just past dusk, Joe was up in his apartment above the garage washing dishes when someone knocked on his door. Well, his hands were full of suds, so he shouted just a minute as he was drying his hands. But the knocking turned into pounding, and it continued. So Joe shouted again, but the knocking only got louder. Somebody desperately wanted to come in.
I opened the door, opened it wide, but there was no one there.
Talk about unsettling, right? I mean, this wasn't just some light tapping or a vague knocking. This was an all-out deliberate pounding. And when he opened the door, there was no one there. And to make matters worse, it wasn't like someone could just knock on the door and then run. Remember, Joe's apartment was above the garage. In order to get to it, one had to climb stairs, and then there was this platform right outside of his front door. Well, Joe walked outside and looked over the railing out into the yard, but everything was quiet. So he closed the door and went back inside. And as he did, the ambience of the room changed. And as crazy as this sounds, a second later, Joe was sure that someone had come inside with him.
I felt like there was something watching me, but I couldn't see anything.
You know, I've heard some people say that they can tell when someone is watching them. They can feel it. And I have to admit, I myself have felt that creepy feeling before. Not exactly sure what it is. But that's exactly what Joe said that he was feeling at that moment. Well, he did his best to shrug it off, and then he sat down to watch TV.
Then suddenly something caught my eye. It was like a light wisp of something. So I looked back into the bedroom, but I didn't see anything.
Joe took a good minute and he searched his tiny apartment, but of course, he found no one. And although other family members had this eerie feeling of being watched from time to time, and they saw some strange things here and there for some reason, which we'll hypothesize why in a moment, whatever this was, well, it seemed to zero in on Joe. Do you remember that dream that Joe had? That nightmare the first night that he moved in? The one where he was running for his life through the woods? Well, about a month later, it seemed as if that dream had come to life. It was just after dark, and Joe was out walking his dog, Fred, when all of a sudden, Fred stopped. He tensed up, and he just started growling at the woods. Well, Joe looked toward the woods, but he didn't see anything. A moment later, Fred bolted and then disappeared into the trees. Joe thought, oh great, bad dog. But that's when he saw him, the man with no legs. At first, like with Vicki, Joe thought he must be a trespasser. And that in itself got the hairs on the back of Joe's neck to stand up. It was dark, and Joe had no idea who this guy was.
I saw this man in a red shirt. He was walking away from me into the trees.
A split second later, Joe realized that he could see through this man's legs. Well, at that moment, a cold chill ran down his back, and just like with Vicki, from then on, Joe just couldn't take his eyes off the guy. And sure enough, just like with Vicki, the guy vanished into thin air. Talk about scary, right? I tell you, me, I'd run. Oh, no, I probably wouldn't. I love dogs. My baby died a couple of years ago, and I miss her so much. So I guess I would probably do exactly what Joe did. Not wanting to leave his dog out in the woods, Joe, with flashlight in hand, started calling out to Fred, and he started moving toward the woods. Well, Fred didn't respond, so Joe just kept on going, and before long he found himself standing in pitch blackness, surrounded by tree trunks. And then something terrifying happened. As he was turning around, getting his bearings, the flashlight fell upon the man with no legs. He was standing just feet from where Joe was, and he was looking at Joe with the emptiest expression that Joe had ever seen. Well, a second later, his nightmare came to life, and he found himself running as fast as he could through the woods, sensing that something horrible was right behind him. And then suddenly, Fred was there, and he wasn't running toward danger. No, he raced right past Joe. He, too, was trying to get away from whatever this was. Well, the two of them made it back to Joe's apartment, and they found that nothing was behind them. Intense, right? Well, the next day, Joe shared his experience with Vicki, and in the light of day, they both went out in the woods, and they discovered that they not only had seen the same man, but they had seen him in the exact same place, and that will be important soon. Well, things only got worse for Joe from there. One night, his ghostly door knocker returned, but this time, well, it didn't just stay outside. It busted the lock and opened the door. The last time some invisible something had knocked on Joe's door, Joe had been washing dishes, but this time he was deep asleep when the pounding began. Well, this jolted him awake, and he sat straight up in a panic. Who in the world was pounding on his door so late at night? Joe shouted and asked who was there, but just like before, there was no answer. So Joe got up, and then he bravely opened the door, and just like before, no one was there.
I looked around at the main house, and all the lights were off. I didn't hear any footsteps of anyone running away, which I thought I would have heard because it was silent that night. I didn't know what to think.
As he stood there, Joe thought about going downstairs and having a quick look around the grounds, but that cold chill had returned, and so did the feeling that he was being watched. So instead, he shut the door and then locked the deadbolt. When he turned around, the oddest thing happened. His dog Fred started growling at him, as if he were the bad guy. And as he was puzzling this, he heard something behind him.
I heard what sounded like the doorknob turning. So I turned around and saw that it was turning. As it did, I could hear the spring compressing, which made this horrific creaking sound.
This time, whatever was outside, it wasn't content with just knocking, so Joe prepared himself for whatever was about to come in. But then he remembered that the door was deadbolted, and it didn't open. A moment later, the doorknob stopped moving. Well, Joe caught his breath, and he just kept watching. The door, the doorknob, the door, but all was silent. And then suddenly, and this is crazy, the door violently busted the deadbolt and flew backward on its hinges, slamming into the frame, letting this powerful gust of wind, carrying leaves and other debris, into the apartment. It must have been terrifying. Well, Joe stood there for a second, but there was no one out on the landing. So he somehow gathered the courage to walk outside. And as he was out there at the railing, he heard someone behind him inside the apartment. So he spun around.
I saw this man. He had a look of complete terror on his face. You could tell he was running for his life. He was breathing heavy. I mean, he was trying to get away from somebody. I've never seen anything like it in my life.
The man looked solid enough, but he was obviously an apparition. He was a terrified young man, and he wasn't the same young man that was in the woods, and he was running from someone. Well, a second later, the apparition disappeared. Right about now, you might be wondering if maybe some supernatural entity had somehow attached itself to the property, or maybe even to Joe himself. Well, as we'll see in the very next segment, perhaps some evil entity had somehow attached itself to them both. Now, I'm sure that many of you have heard about John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy, but what about Herbert Richard Baumeister? Well, some of you, no doubt, are familiar with the story, but for those who are not, let me tell the tale. Herb Baumeister, as he would come to be known, was born to an upper-middle-class family on April 7, 1947, in Indianapolis, Indiana. And although he appeared to be part of a normal family, something about him seemed seriously off from the very beginning. At one point in elementary school, he put a dead crow on his teacher's desk just to get a reaction. At another point, he asked his schoolmates what they thought it might be like to drink one's own urine. So his parents had him tested, and he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and possibly having more than one personality. I guess his condition wasn't severe enough to separate him from society, though, because he grew up, graduated high school, and even went on to college. In 1971, he married a woman named Juliana Sater, and they had 3 children. Well, even though he was odd, he did fairly well in business, and by 1990, the family owned 2 stores and was making a good bit of money. And the very next year, he bought the property at 1111 East 156th Street, Carmel, Indiana. Yes, the very same property that Robert and Vicki Graves would buy just a decade and a half later. Now, a few years before this, in the mid-'80s, various young men started to go missing, and every once in a while, one of their bodies would be found along Highway 70, not far from where the Baumeisters were living. But right around the time that the family bought this big, beautiful house with 18 acres, those bodies stopped turning up along the highway, but the disappearances continued. I bet you can guess where this is going, can't you? Well, in the winter of 1995, the Baumeister's son had found a partially buried skeleton in the woods behind the house. So, being a boy, he proceeded to put the skull on a stick and scare his sisters with it. Well, they ran and told their mother, and this opened a can of worms that ultimately ended with what should have been Herb Baumeister's arrest. On June 24, 1996, investigators recovered human bone fragments belonging to at least 8 different people buried in the woods behind the Baumeister's house. An investigation discovered that Herb Baumeister had been living a double life. In one, he was a devoted family man, but in the other, he pretended to be this guy named Brian Smart. Brian Smart would go to the bars, and then, now, check this out. He would tell his victims that he was renting an apartment above the garage at his employer's home. He would tell them how beautiful the grounds were and that there was this swimming pool in the basement of the main house. And then, of course, he would invite them back. Why wouldn't he tell them that he was the owner of the house and instead just a tenant in the apartment above the garage? Well, that's anyone's guess. But maybe that's why he attached himself to Joe. In many respects, Joe would later be the person who Herb Baumeister was pretending to be, just this average Joe living in an apartment above the garage. Well, his MO was to bring them back to the house, take them down into the pool room, and then ultimately strangle them in the pool, which makes it so much creepier when Joe had his experience in the pool. When Robert and Vicki Graves first looked at the house, the realtor told them that Herb Baumeister had lived there and he had buried bodies on the property. So now you know why it had been sitting for so long. But remember, Vicki was a scientist, and when her husband asked her if it bothered her, her response was something like, well, the house didn't kill anyone, right? So they didn't give it a second thought. But when all of this funny business with ghosts started happening, well, Vicki began to question. What would that mean? And her and Joe started to wonder if these apparitions were maybe somehow some of Herb Baumeister's victims and they were in some way reaching out. Well, one day, Joe was out on the grounds when he found a bone. It looked like a leg bone. And where he found it? Well, it wasn't too far from where he and Vicki had seen the man with no legs. So he showed it to Vicki. Maybe this leg bone belonged to the man with no legs. A little later, one night, Robert, Vicki, and Joe were all watching one of the old news segments about some of the missing men who Herb Baumeister had been suspected of killing, and they started showing photos. Well, right in the middle of this photo list, Joe jumped up and startled everyone.
That's him. That's the guy I saw in my room that night. Without a doubt, that is the guy I saw in my apartment.
Many people, as I'm sure you know, refer to this mystery as Fox Hollow Farm, because that was the name that was given to the property, and it's still widely known by that name today. There were a lot of unexplainable events that have happened at this property, but by far the most terrifying event, I'm sure, is what happened to Joe when he was taking a swim in that pool. One evening, Joe, his friend Jeremy, and both of the Graves' teenage boys were down in the pool room enjoying the water. The last thing anyone was thinking about were ghosts. At the bottom of the pool, there were these dead beetles, and everyone was taking turns deep diving for them. Well, at one point, it was Joe's turn, so he took a deep breath and he swam down and he got one. When he came back up, he immediately went to the edge of the pool to catch his breath, and that's when it happened.
All of a sudden, I felt this sensation on my neck. I first thought it was one of the boys, but I saw them in the opposite end of the pool, and I realized it wasn't any of them.
This was a pretty big pool, and everyone was at least 20 feet away. Well, he took a minute, collected himself, shrugged it off, and then started swimming toward the others. But halfway across the pool, out in the middle, something grabbed at his neck again, and it felt like hands. And this time, these invisible hands, well, they wrapped themselves around his throat, and then they tightened their grip. A minute later, they began to pull him toward the bottom of the pool. He, of course, fought with everything that he had, and for just a moment, he thought, well, this was it. But at the very last second, somehow, he managed to get himself to the edge and then out of the pool.
I turned to look at him, and he puts his hands up to his neck. Pure panic just comes over his face. He was not faking. True fear, true panic. He just wanted to leave.
After this, the fun was over, and as I said, to date, that was the most terrifying, unexplainable event that has happened at that house. And Joe? Well, he, of course, no longer lives at that house. So, verdict.
You first this time.
Okay, well, I think it's kind of funny that I do these stories because in some ways I feel like I'm the world's biggest skeptic, right? And I asked myself, the property's been there for a while. These murders were committed in the 90s, I guess, and these bodies were put on the property in the 90s. Well, why is it that basically Joe has had the bulk of the most terrifying experiences? Vicki too, a little bit. But why not anyone else? So I don't know. I get kind of skeptical with stuff like that. I have a difficult time with this one. What about you?
Well, I read a lot about this case and more than I actually planned to going into it. It's one of those where you start reading and then you just find more and more and more information. And I found pretty much 3 prevailing theories that I felt were pretty credible and very interesting. One is that there is an elemental on the property there at Fox Hollow Farm, and that is the presence that manifests different things around and inside the house. The second theory that I read about was it is the spirits of the deceased men who are still trying to get out of Fox Hollow Farm and break free. And so that would explain what's going on there as far as the hauntings. And then the third one, of course, is Herb Baumeister himself is there haunting the property. Maybe not so much haunting, but he just can't leave is the theory that I heard. So I feel like with all that research and all of those theories that maybe all 3 are true. Maybe this specific property has got all 3 things going on.
Yeah. So you think there's something to the story?
I do think there's something.
It's interesting that I'm skeptical about it because it really reminds me of what happened with my own family, right? When my family saw Lucifer, supposedly. I was even in the apartment the night that my dad was screaming at God to help remove Lucifer from the house. So, as you know, we did a complete mystery on this. And if you guys would like to see it, it's here.